This is the According to John podcast. Today I will speak for the second time with Dr. Ekaterini Tsalampouni.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure
Yes.
to be with you.
Maybe you can start by giving a brief introduction to yourself before we go into our topic.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as Ekaterini Tsalampouni, I'm a professor at the Faculty of Theology of the Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. I teach New Testament, interpretation, theology, and also the whatever. I'm also very much interested, and I work a lot on manuscripts. In fact, now in Thessaloniki, we have a very interesting project on transcribing manuscripts of First and Second Thessalonians, mainly from the Byzantine period, 9th century onwards, minuscules, most of them. And this material is going to be used for the Editio Critica Major of these two letters of Paul. For us, it's not just a sentimental, let's say, important project, from a sentimental point of view, important project in the sense that we come from Thessaloniki and we read Thessalonians, First and Second Thessalonians, but also is an interesting project because it's something that is totally new in Greece. And many of our students are working on this. So that's more or less a few things about myself and about the project on manuscripts.
Yes, thank you. So today we will speak about the Byzantine TextType. But before we go into that, maybe you can say something about, in general, what do we mean when we say a text type in the,
Yeah. Well, let's first start from the very beginning that although we now have our Bibles in these nice editions, many editions, in the very ancient times, the text was written, it was handwritten on first on pieces of papyrus and also other sorts of material like stones or whatever else one might use as writing material, but later they were also written biblical texts on parchment, much later on paper. But for the very first centuries up to the 16th century, the text of the Bible, as well as other texts, of course, not just the Bible, were written by hand. And these are the famous manuscripts. In the case of the New Testament, the famous New Testament manuscripts, which are very important nowadays because, first of all, they somehow reflect the history of our text. They are also witnesses of ancient piety and religiosity, but also they are, let's say, great monuments of culture. And when the text is handwritten, it's a difficult story than when the text is, let's say, edited or printed, as it's nowadays. Each manuscript has its own, let's say, character, its own personality. And of course, they were also, what we usually don't think about is that there were different traditions regarding the text in special areas of the ancient world. This doesn't mean, of course, that there were very big differences between these different traditions. And we nowadays usually call them types. Of course, we're very careful nowadays regarding types because we know that sometimes they are very fluid in the sense that you cannot always be sure that we have just one type. We can also see within this general tradition, let's say, smaller traditions, sub-traditions, like, for example, even the so-called Byzantine type that we're going to discuss about today. So we call them types, and very, very, let's say, carefully, we usually say that there was an Alexandrine tradition, the famous Alexandrinian type, which is mainly represented by Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus and part of Codex Alexandrinus, but there were also the famous Western type, which actually is not Western, but comes from Syria, or eastern, let's say the eastern part of the Christian world. And of course, we have the famous Caesarean and the Byzantine type. But these are very, very, let's say, artificial ways, arbitrary ways of describing these traditions. Where now we know that there is also some fluidity among these types.
So you used some words here like codex. So what is a codex? When we say Codex Alexandrinus, what is that?
Well, a codex is a book. And the codex is more or less, we have to think about it in the way we have our books now bound, and actually it's the same technique and the same idea. So we have our texts actually bound either well, the material can be either papyrus at the very early stage, but it was given up because papyrus is a very sensitive kind of material. It can very easily be destroyed by humidity or other forms of destruction. And then there came, of course, parchment that was made by the skin of animals, which was more, let's say, it could last more and was not so easily destroyed. So then it was cut in pieces that were folded, and these were actually bound together to make the codex. We have codices of the New Testament from very, very early times. And there is an interesting thing that nowadays we think that early Christians used only codex in order to preserve, to have their own book, holy book, the scriptures, which is very interesting because we have to think of the Judaism, for example, that even nowadays the text, the Torah, the sacred text of Judaism, is in these scrolls, which is a very different type of having a book. This is a very interesting thing, and I think that there's a long discussion why. Of course, a codex is more practical than a scroll. You can more easily go to and fro. And the other thing is that probably that was a kind of, let's say, indirect, more or less a way of of Christians to somehow distinguish themselves from the tradition of Judaism. So, I mean, it was a kind of identity marker, but this is a long discussion that one has to, we don't know exactly. And of course, there's also the possibility that sometime we find also something that it's a scroll. It comes from the Christian milieu, but this is still not the case.
So when do we have the first or the earliest codex with the New Testament?
Well, the very earliest codex, well, we have fragments of papyri, even from the end of 2nd century, and we know that they come from codices. But if you ask me when we have the one codex that is full, I mean the whole text of the New Testament that comes from the 4th century with Codex Vaticanus, where we have actually the full text. I mean the full New Testament text, the whole New Testament text. Earlier, of course, we have parts of codices, and we have also fragments that we think that they came from codices. As I said, by the end of the 2nd century already.
So when we say Vaticanus, what does that mean? Does it mean it was founded in Rome, or?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because nowadays there are many people who when they hear this word Vaticanus, they think that it's something that comes from the Roman Catholic Church, and they are very, very suspicious. Actually, this text comes from the East, from the Alexandria. That's a high probable place of provenance. It's called Vaticanus because it's preserved nowadays in the Vatican Library. And by the way, you can visit the digital Vatican Library, where you can see Codex Vaticanus. And Codex Vaticanus reflects the Alexandrine tradition of the New Testament, which is also the tradition of the text used by Athanasius or Cyril of Alexandria, and all these Alexandrine, let's say, church tradition. So if you read Athanasius or if you read Cyril, for example, you can see that they cite the text as it is in this Alexandrian tradition. So the Vatican Codex Vaticanus is a very, very important witness of the very early stages of the New Testament text.
Okay, so we can move on now to speak more about the Byzantine text type.
Yes.
What is it? What do we mean when we say Byzantine text type?
Well, when we talk about the Byzantine text, actually, the Byzantine, some people, especially in the Western scholarship, use the term majority text. You can find both of them in literature. Actually, we mean the text that is preserved in the majority of the manuscripts of the New Testament, especially from the 9th century onwards. Well, from 9th century onwards, we have, let's say, the introduction of the minuscule script as, let's say, the way of writing the text. Up to that time, we had the uncials, which means only capital letters. There was, let's say, not distinguished, not separated, but just like a continuous text. By the 9th century, which is also called the beginning of the Byzantine Renaissance and so on, we have the introduction of the minuscule script handwriting as a new way of writing text, because it made easier the text to be read. And then we have also a kind of establishment, more or less, of a certain form of the New Testament text. I would say something like a stabilization, which also has political, let's say, explanations. I mean, it's a time when also the empire wants to have, let's say, kind of unity when it comes to the text, to the liturgy. That's part also of this political development. Of course, I must say here that although it's generally thought the Byzantine text is a later, more or less, development of the text, we know that we have also ancient readings in Byzantine text, which means actually that the Byzantine text also reflects earlier traditions, because it's copied from earlier texts. For example, we have the famous Codex of Ephraim, which is also a text which is from the 6th century and reflects also part of this Byzantine type tradition. And what else we need to know is that the Byzantine text is an eclectic text. What this thing means? It means that actually it's a text that was created by comparing and different kinds of different manuscripts and choosing what it was thought that it was the best readings. It were the best readings. So it was a kind of critical edition in a way, and we have to think that this is really a very interesting aspect, that actually we have a text that at some point ancient Christians tried somehow to get rid of perhaps mistakes that were made in previous copyings of the text, or they tried somehow to smooth somehow some things that probably were not so easily acceptable as from a grammatical point of view, or from the point of the sentence, let's say, structure and so on. And that's why we say that the Byzantine text is also, so to say, the most, it's an eclectic text. And the most ancient, let's say, witness, because I said it comes in the 9th century, but still we have ancient manuscripts that have many resemblances to these 9th century manuscripts. It is Codex Alexandrinus from the 4th, 5th century. Codex Alexandrinus preserves this Byzantine type, more or less, in the Gospels, whereas in the Pauline epistles, it's the Alexandrine text. It's a very interesting case, the Codex Alexandrinus. In any case, the Byzantine text was also very important for the development of the Byzantine, of the New Testament tradition, text tradition in Western Christianity, because it was used as the basis for the Erasmus text. Erasmus also used this majority text for his first editions of the text, printed editions in Europe. So it's a very important, I would say, type, although I must say that for some periods, for a long period, so to say, it was in a way not so highly regarded by scholars who wanted to have text critical editions, especially the very first editions of Nestle-Aland New Testament, Novum Testamentum edition. There we have a preference, and we still have a preference for the Alexandrinian text type, because it is accepted as earlier, of course. But I must say that in the later editions, especially in the edition 26th, 37th, and now to 88th, we have a we have, let's say, a shift in the apparatus, where we can see then an interest in including also many of Byzantine witnesses, which is a very interesting development, and a good development, I must say.
Yeah. So if the Byzantine text is present in the Gospels, in the Codex Alexandrinus, why was it not? Why was it undermined for a while?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think this comes from a notion that nowadays has changed, I think, a lot. And I'm going to say some things later about this. I think the main, more or less, aim of this earlier phase of text criticism was to go as back as possible and as close to the original and the text and the autographs. I mean, the very first texts that came from the hands of the New Testament authors. Nowadays, we have given up this, at least in most in Europe. Well, in the States, sometimes it's a little bit different, but in Europe, more or less, we have given up this, let's say, search, because nowadays we know better about how people wrote and copied text in antiquity. And nowadays, of course, we want to go back for sure, but we're also interested in including and taking into consideration as many aspects of this text tradition as possible. So yes, Codex Alexandrinus is an earlier witness, and I must say Codex Alexandrinus is not the only one. Of course, we don't have any witnesses of the Byzantine text in the 2nd or 3rd century, but we have in the 4th century, as I said, 5th century, and then we have a lot of, many church writers who seem to reflect more or less a tradition, text tradition that is close to the Byzantine text, like John Chrysostom, for example, Asterius.
Do we have early church fathers from the 3rd century that reflect?
Well, not 3rd century. I would say, well, we have the Cappadocians for sure, John Chrysostom, but this is later.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not 3rd century, Theodoret of Cyrus, and of course, but it's good. I mean, it means that, well, in the 5th century, we start to have a tendency more or less to find this kind of text in our ancient texts. And this is a very interesting development, which means that it is also an old, a very old text tradition. That's why I say that nowadays we have changed a lot when it comes to assessing the importance of the Byzantine text. And of course, I must say that for the Eastern Christian churches, the Byzantine text is a very important text because it's their text. It's the text that we read. And all these translations that are used from the Slavs, for example, or so on, are based on this Byzantine type of text.
Yeah. So the Greek Orthodox Church, we can say, used the Byzantine. Are they? I think I've heard you say some. If I'm correct, you said sometime that we really have two Byzantine text types, or am I wrong?
No, we don't know exactly how many we have. I mean, there are some very interesting nowadays studies on the Byzantine text, and there is a growing interest also in Western scholarship about Byzantine text. I must say that there is a lack of interest here in the Orthodox world, and this is something that we have to think about a lot. Only very few people who are actually working on Byzantine text or generally on New Testament textual criticism in the Eastern world. Well, we know that, for example, well, this is not mine. This is there is a very eminent German scholar called Klaus Wachtel who has worked a lot on Byzantine type manuscripts, and I think he mentions that especially for the Acts, he managed to distinguish two different sub-traditions in the Byzantine text. But I must say that we have a lot to do in order to be able to decide what's going on. There is a very interesting pioneer work done by von Soden, and he's the only one who actually worked that much on Byzantine text, and he tried to distinguish various different kinds of traditions within the Byzantine text type, which is also very interesting. But as I've said, there is a lot to be done. Let me say that the minuscules, the minuscule manuscripts have not been fully studied. I mean, up to now, scholarship focused mainly on the uncials and majuscules, or uncials, as we say, and of course on papyri. And the minuscules came later. And of course, we need to discuss and read these texts as well. And of course, there is also, let's say, a lacuna in our scholarship when it comes to the famous lectionaries, which also probably, which most of them are also related to this Byzantine type. When I say lectionaries, just to explain for your audience, it's actually the manuscripts that include only the pericope that are read during the services, the liturgical services. And of course, this is also a very interesting part of the tradition, of the text tradition, that has not been, not just fully, I mean, it's only less than 1% of the manuscripts transcribed and read. So you need.
So, yeah, so let me ask you this then. Why, one could say, why should we care about the texts from the 10th century and onwards? Why we should only look on the texts that are from the 4th century, for example?
Yeah.
Why? What do you say to a person who holds that view?
This is a very good question. I mean, why we make so much fuss about the text? Of course, the idea to go to the most ancient text is not wrong. I mean, why not? If the Alexandrian text is the oldest, why not? We go there. But I have to distinguish here to make some interesting, let's say, distinctions and give some explanations. First of all, from a scholarly point of view, of course, we want to find the oldest, let's say, text tradition, or let's say to discuss all possible developments of this textual tradition. And in this respect, of course, the Alexandrian text is a very important text, for sure. And not just that, the Western text as well, or the Caesarean, whatever else we can have and we can study. But there is also another aspect which is very interesting. For me, there is a very, very interesting let's say, idea that came from not from an Orthodox scholar, but from an Anglican one, my dear friend David Parker, who talked about the living text. we have that, and he tried to explain that we have that many, let's say, different kinds of traditions within the text tradition of the New Testament, because the text is alive, because the text that is being read, that is being reproduced, copied, and recopied, and so on. So it's very alive, because the communities that read, the worshiping communities that read this text are also alive. And from this point of view, this text, the Byzantine text, is the living text of a certain Christian tradition and community. Our own, the Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, not only the Greek Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, let's say, tradition, church, and this makes this text tradition a very, very important one for us. And I think this is the argument that, let's say, the answer that I would give to somebody who'd say, why should we care about the Byzantine text? I don't agree with those who say that because there was a revival of interest on Byzantine text by those, let's say, people who, let's say, more or less try to advertise and this majority text hypothesis, which actually says that it's the safest text because we have most of the manuscripts are come from this type. I don't agree with that, because this would also eliminate all the other traditions that also were the living traditions of certain communities. As I've said at the very beginning, for example, the Alexandrinian text was the text of the Alexandria Church, of all these great church fathers that we highly respect nowadays and honor. And I don't want to say, yes, only the text that has so many witnesses is the one that we should focus on. No, I would say that it's a living tradition and it's our living tradition. And that's why we need to study, we need to, let's say, spend much time and invest time in producing critical editions of the Byzantine text, of trying to understand what was going on, to see how the church fathers used this text and why they used it, and so on.
Yeah. Could it also be argued that just because a text type is found later, it could actually contain things that are earlier in the tradition? That is, that this later text type is a copy of an earlier text.
Yeah. Of course, for example, I usually say to my classes, you can have a manuscript that comes from the, let's say, 11th century or 12th century, and probably copies from a much earlier manuscript. And that makes it a very important witness when it comes to the text. But as I've said before, there is much to be done, and we need to search and to study very, very closely. And of course, in order to do that, we need to read as many as possible of these manuscripts. That's my idea, that we need to have the possibility to read the texts, to analyze, to compare, to try to find the so-called stemma, which is actually the connections between the texts, the manuscripts, and to see whether they come from the same scriptorium or whether the one copies the other, and so on. Yes, it's possible, but of course, it doesn't mean that, let's say, everything in these Byzantine manuscripts of the 9th century is ancient.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to think that there was this revision, this critical revision, this trying to review the text and make it more fluid and more smooth, and also correct some mistakes probably, or correct the things that were a little bit clumsy in the text, in the original earlier phase of the text. And so we have to, actually, this is what scholarship needs to do, to see what's going on with the Byzantine text. But as I've said, since the Byzantine text was not so much, was not so important in the earlier critical editions, people didn't spend that much time, scholars, I mean, in studying it. Nowadays, things have changed. Things have changed. We have wonderful editions, critical editions. We have very good studies, many, let's say, doctoral theses on the Byzantine text or aspects of the Byzantine text tradition. I must say again, in European universities and not that much in Greece. And I think that this is, I mean, it's a very promising, let's say, research field for young scholars who would like to spend some time trying to untangle, let's say,
Yeah.
the what's going on with the text tradition, the Byzantine period.
Yeah. So I mean, if we speak of the Byzantine text, and but is it the case that it is exclusively used in the Byzantine Empire? I mean, for example, Saint Photios, which is a very famous saint in the Orthodox Church. Um, if I'm correct, he doesn't use the Byzantine text, or am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. I mean, there is a study that actually Photios didn't exactly use what we call now Byzantine text. He used a different kind of text. Of course, we have to be a little bit careful with, well, patristic citations are a very important, interesting, let's say, question as well. I mean, they're also very important witnesses when it comes to the text, but we always have to check whether actually they are, let's say, just have that in memory, the text, and just read it, or of course, whether what we have nowadays is part of also a copying tradition of their books. I mean, we have cases where, for example, I think it was I have read recently a very interesting small article on the internet, on a blog about textual criticism, where actually it was shown that in John Chrysostom, the text that we find cited by the Church Father in the earliest manuscripts of John Chrysostom is different from the one we find later, because probably somebody, the scribe, decided to make it, change the way he knew himself the text. So we need also, in order to be very careful when it comes to church fathers and say something definitely, we need to have critical editions of their texts, which is also a desideratum in our, let's say, scholarship. We must say that for most church fathers, we don't have a text, a critical text, which means in very, very simple words that we haven't studied the manuscript tradition of their text. So it's not just the New Testament. I must say that in the New Testament we are a little bit better, in a better situation, but also church fathers. Let's think that for John Chrysostom, we don't have, for example, a critical edition. And John Chrysostom is the most cited church father, not only in the Orthodox world, where he's very, very, let's say, popular, but also in the Protestant world, in the Roman Catholic world, everybody talks about John Chrysostom. So you see, we have so many things to do.
Yeah.
So many wonderful things to be done when it comes to reading the manuscripts. And of course, I would say that in Greece, and we have a very, let's say, we have an advantage. We're very close to all these libraries that actually have preserved these texts, and not only that, of course, the language of the manuscripts is not our modern Greek, I must say. That doesn't mean that all modern Greeks can read manuscripts. But I think that for young people who would like to work on manuscripts, it's easier for us because the letters are the same. And we have the same mentality regarding the language and how the language is displayed and so on. So I think that it's something that we should keep in mind, and we should think that this is a very good challenge for the future.
Yeah. So one thing that some on the internet are saying is that, oh, look, you have so many differences in the manuscripts. This means that Christianity falls, you know. are the difference we are speaking about, are they major? Are they saying, like in one manuscript it says Christ never was crucified or raised, and in another said yes it was, and what are we talking about here?
No. We're not talking about this kind of
Yeah,
differences for sure. We are talking about smaller differences, like for example, Mariam and Maria and things like that. There is, as I said, in the Byzantine type, we have this kind of smoothing. Let's say the text, making it more readable, more understandable, and of course, yes, of course, there are some also very interesting differences. There are also some additions, for example, of passages that they don't exist in all parts of the tradition. For example, the famous passage about the adulterous woman in John's Gospel or the end of Mark, but this doesn't change, I mean, drastically
yeah,
Christian faith. It's very interesting, of course, because it shows us different kinds of, let's say, of theological
yeah,
lines and theological discussions, but that doesn't mean that we have a totally different Christianity. And of course, at the very beginning of Christianity, we in the very first centuries, diversity is the main, let's say, feature of Christianity, which of course fades out as the time goes on. I said at the very beginning very quickly that it's also a political development. We have one empire, we need to have one faith, we need to have one Bible, one liturgy, and so on. So, but this comes later, much later.
yeah,
The Byzantine type of text, let's say, fits within this kind of framework. But that doesn't mean that it's of lower quality or that it's not to be trusted as a text. It doesn't also mean that all the other kinds of text tradition were not orthodox or not accepted. No, that was not the case in the ancient world.
yeah. I mean, if we only had one text from the beginning to the end, we would not know how, we would not know if it's totally fabricated or not. So the fact that we have this plurality of texts with these small differences, I think it helps us also to come closer to the original, let's say. So, but let me ask you one more thing, that it's also interesting that if we just look within the New Testament, we have these differences within the four Gospels, for example. So, I mean, this is not something that Christians have opposed from the beginning. I know there was one who wanted to harmonize the four Gospels, but in general, this idea was rejected. The different ways to express the gospel was something encouraged. But then again, some say that, oh, these differences, like how many women went to the tomb, shows that they're wrong because they can't all be right. So what do you say to that objection?
Yes, well, it's very good that you mentioned this ancient church, let's say, attitude towards diversity. The ancient church was not afraid of diversity. And of course, there was this, there were many attempts in the ancient world to harmonize the various gospels and the gospel traditions. And of course, you mentioned Tatian, who actually tried to have this diatesaron, the famous, let's say, harmonization of the four gospels, which was not accepted. That doesn't mean, of course, that people were condemning him, for God's sake, but it was not something that actually at the very end was adopted as a practice of the church. We have Irenaeus saying that we need the four gospels like the four points in the horizon, which is very interesting, which means that we need a kind of diversity that actually this diversity also somehow can include the whole world, very ecumenical in a way. And this is the attitude at the very beginning, and also the discussions about the canon at the very beginning of the discussion were not in the way we nowadays think they were. And we know that up to very late, we have different kinds of canon lists, especially when it comes to the eastern part of the Christian world. We have canon lists that include the Book of Revelation and others that don't include the Book of Revelation. And these are preserved or are, let's say, composed by various church fathers, others accepting the revelation, others not accepting it. And it was never, let's say, a major issue. I mean, an issue that had to do with heresy or something like that. So from the very beginning, we have, let's say, a more flexible attitude towards this diversity. And of course, you can also see, of course, there comes also, when we go back to the gospel text, of course, the gospel narratives have many differences and they seem alike, but they are not exactly alike. But I think that this diversity, and you mentioned the women in the visiting the tomb, and of course all resurrection narratives, all four gospels have many differences. They have some common points, okay, like the empty tomb or the women visiting the tomb, but otherwise the traditions, the narratives go to different directions for various reasons, reasons of theological reasons, reasons of tradition. And I think that this is a good thing and not a bad thing. This is a very good sign that probably our gospel writers are not lying to us. Because, you know, if you want to have a very persuasive story, you try to eliminate all difficult, of course, let's say, points of the story you are going to tell. And then, of course, if we are more than one, people will try to stick to the same story and say the same thing. But don't do that, which is very uncomfortable. I mean, it's very awkward.
Yeah.
And this is something that, and of course, one would say, okay, at the very beginning, they couldn't discuss things among themselves and decide what, let's say, for a common story. But even later, the church came and accepted all four.
Yeah.
I said, I don't have a problem about that. I don't have a problem with the short ending of Mark. I don't have a problem with Matthew's version or Luke's version or John's version. I don't have a problem with Revelation, whether it's in the canon or not. So we see that actually the idea was that we have a more, the canon, let's say, of course, has a normative character for sure.
Yeah.
But it's not restrictive in the sense that it somehow cannot be, in a way, from a theological point of view, flexible.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a crime and the witnesses they're not only saying the same thing, you know, they're saying every word in the same order, and something that is stinking.
Yes, you're right. And of course, we have always, and this is something that we learned very well from reduction criticism, which was a very interesting, let's say, tendency approach in methodology in the 20th century in biblical studies. And we learned a lot about from reduction criticism. And what we learned is that actually gospel writers are not just collectors of traditions and stories, and then they just put them together and make a patchwork. That is their gospel. No, and then of course a very trained eye, like our eyes, could discern this kind of smaller traditions. But we know that gospel writers were theologians. And of course, they choose to say their stories the way they choose because they want to, let's say, to convey a message, theological message, and it's also the faith of their community. So, and I think this is very important and perhaps could help us in a way to explain many of the differences among the Gospels that you already mentioned.
Yeah. So I think I have asked you everything I wanted. I know at the end we went a little away from the Byzantine TextType because there were some new questions that I had in my mind. So is it something you think we have forgotten to mention that is important?
Yeah, I think we should mention that there was an initiative from the Ecumenical Patriarchate to have a critical edition of the Byzantine text, the famous patriarchal edition of the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a very interesting edition, I must say, because it was the very first attempt to take into consideration lectionaries. And it was, we have the Byzantine text in our tradition, but so many printed editions and various other editions that have differences and also mistakes, errors. And there was this necessity to produce a critical edition that could somehow be used in the liturgical books of the church. Unfortunately, it didn't work that well. And this is really a pity because it's a very good first attempt. Of course, the famous Professor Antoniadis, who worked together with a committee in this work, had a very limited access to manuscripts. He didn't use a lot of manuscripts. It was a very beginning of the 20th century, as I said. And of course, that made it difficult sometimes. And of course, we need to work. We need to have a new edition of the Antoniadis edition where we should include more manuscripts. There was also an attempt to do so by the University of Birmingham, where there was a project some years ago funded by the United Bible Societies at the request of the Orthodox Church and the Greek Bible Society. They funded a project and they produced a critical edition of John's Gospel. But unfortunately, there was hope that the Orthodox churches would be very interested in promoting and supporting this project, but there was no reaction. At least the reaction was not so positive, or it was a little bit indifferent, so they gave up the project. And of course, there are many other projects for sure, but I think that if I'm not mistaken, some months ago, the Greek Bible Society published, let's say, the patriarchal edition of printed actually, the patriarchal edition of the text of the New Testament text. So if people want, they can have this in pocket size and so on. So I mentioned that not to say that there's again a revival of interest in the patriarchal text. And so this is something that we should also keep in mind, that there is a desideratum, there is a necessity for the Orthodox Greek-speaking world to have a critical edition of the Byzantine text. That would also help us to make, let's say, that it could also be included in our liturgical books and so on.
Yeah, I mean, my view right now of this is that I think textual criticism and this, it's important in, let's say, in a scholarly environment. At the same time, I think that as believers, when I go to church, it's not so important. I feel that the text we have now is sufficient because, for example, for my yaya, for my grandmother, or for my toddler, or for me also, when I go to the church, I'm not so concerned with what some papyrus said in that. In my perspective, it's what the church has handed me on. I will receive that in faith. But however, when we go as theologians to study, to evaluate these texts, I think it is important. So this is like two different thoughts I have in my mind at the same time.
Yeah. Well, they're very, very, let's say, legitimate thoughts that you make, and of course they, let's say they are compatible with this idea of the living text that I mentioned before. Of course, there is an aspect that has to do with this our scholarly, let's say, interests to see the sub-traditions, for example, or what happened with this and that in the Byzantine text. On the other hand, let me mention the necessity to have our text, the text that is used in our liturgical printed editions nowadays, it's not uniform.
Yeah.
And this, it doesn't have to do that much with the living tradition, but it has to do with errors or what kind of copies they were used in different kinds of printed editions of readings in the liturgical context. So I would say from this point of view, it would be interesting.
Yeah.
And it would be a necessity. Well, of course, that won't make your grandmother or somebody else less or more faithful, for sure. But on the other hand, let's think that there are also people who are not like, let's say, modern people think differently. They would like to also to know more about their text. And it's a different approach of the church and the religious life and liturgical life in the church. So I would say that it's not a bad thing
Yeah.
to have a critical text. It's not against our faith. It's not against our. It won't make us, of course, better Christians, of course. But on the other hand, perhaps it would help us in many cases to have a clean, in a way, text, and the text that it's closer to this ancient Byzantine tradition that we had.
Yeah, for sure. It's very interesting. And I mean, myself, I'm very interested in textual criticism. But yeah, so is it something else you want to mention that I have forgotten? I'm sure there are a lot of things we could say.
Of course, there are many things. There are many
Yeah.
things about the Byzantine text, but I think that more or less we should keep in mind that, and this is of course an answer to this, let's say, interest in finding the original text and actually ignoring all the other kinds of all the diversity. I would say that it's a kind of richness if we include all these kind of different traditions in our studies or in our books of studying the New Testament, the New Testament text. There is no text chaos. And who is afraid of text chaos after all? The early church was not afraid of variety and diversity. And of course, this perhaps is an answer also to your previous question. Not all readings, these kind of variations are, let's say, historically equivalent, but all of them are necessary.
Can you explain that?
I mean that, of course, historically equivalent, and there are some that, of course, are more ancient readings and are more, let's say, not that younger, but that doesn't make them less important because they used to be, and they probably they still are, part of the living tradition of certain communities of faith. And this is very important, especially in our world. And I think that we have to somehow to respect and acknowledge this kind of diversity in the ancient world. And of course, it can teach us a lot, even nowadays, about diversity and about accepting and respecting diversity.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for this conversation. It has created many new thoughts in me and questions also. But this is the point with these kind of discussions. The point is not to say you need to think this way. It's to have a discussion and to further also the interest in this kind of study.
I agree. The most important thing is to have questions, not answers.
Yeah.
And I thank you very much for this interesting discussion. And I hope we meet again in the future.
Yes. Thank you very much for.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. This is the According to John podcast. You can subscribe if you want, and I will see you soon.